Hello everyone and welcome to an introduction to the circular economy. This webinar is brought to you by the Institution of Environmental Sciences and will be presented by Andrea Crump, Head of the Sustainability Team at the London Borough of Sutton Council. Today we look at how new circular thinking is applied by business and cities to drive real change to the current systems in play, aiming to eliminate the very notion of waste. Andrea's work sees her driving delivery of sustainability measures across the borough and includes programmes for sustainable energy, resource efficiency and the green economy. Click the question button at any point during the webinar to have your questions included in the Q&A section. Thank you for your attention. Please stand by. This webinar will be starting shortly.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Andrea Crump. Thank you, Emma, for the introduction, and thank you to the IES for hosting the webinar today. I will be giving you a brief introduction to the circular economy. As Emma said, I'm the Sustainability Manager over at the London Borough of Sutton Council, and I'm also one of 3 of the London Circular Economy Champions. And I was chosen for that role based on the ambition we have in Sutton to help drive the circular economy forward. And part of that role has been learning from experts in the field about the circular economy, and that's some of what I wanted to share with you today. So without further ado, I will take you through to the presentation. So what I'll talk about today is basically an overview of the circular economy. Why do we need it in the first place? What is it? How are businesses moving towards the circular economy? And how are cities helping that transition as well? Just to kick off, here's a definition. Now this is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And as you can see, they believe that the circular economy is something which is restorative and regenerative by design, and it aims to keep products and materials at their highest value at all times, and importantly it distinguishes 2 cycles, technical and biological. In another definition, the Zero Waste Scotland organisation believe that circular economy is sustainable, and as much as possible it eliminates waste. And it's an alternative to our current linear approach, and I'll explain that in a minute. And it means that products and materials are kept in a high value state of use for as long as possible. So in essence, what we're talking about is an economy that eliminates waste and recognises value and tries to preserve that value. And through the presentation, I'll try and explain the main concepts behind this. So this is an image of our current economy. Mostly what we do is a very linear way of looking at materials. We take resources out of the ground or out of the air, out of the environment. We create something with them. We make a product. It's then bought by somebody who uses it, and then it's thrown away. And this creates wasted in terms of energy and wasted materials as well. And sometimes the value that we get out of that product, so the actual useful time of that product is really short. So if you think about something like a coffee cup, how long do you actually use that for? It's probably less than 10 minutes. Then it's thrown away, and it's often, most usually, it's put into a landfill. This model of our economy has been so successful that we've actually started to design in obsolescence. So we've made things more disposable. We've actually created a whole industry which is based around making us buy more and more materials. Okay, so if this model is so successful, why do we need to change in the first place? Well, here on this diagram you can see some of the trends in terms of population changes and our use of materials over the years. And you can see that our population obviously is continuing to grow. And as part of that, we're predicted to have 3 billion new middle class consumers by 2025. And this will be the largest and fastest rise in disposable income ever. So those people are all going to want what we have in the Western world already. By 2010, we were using 65 billion tonnes of raw materials, and that entered the economic system every year. And this is expected to grow to 82 billion tonnes by 2020. Our extraction of primary materials has tripled over the past 4 decades, and we're already seeing that start to create conflicts and shortages in terms of supply. We are basically using more resources than the Earth can handle. I'm sure you'll have come across the term natural capital before. So we're over-extracting from the Earth. And when we over-extract natural capital, we end up with problems. We end up with things like soil degradation, the collapse of fisheries, and the impacts that we're seeing from climate change. And we're seeing global growth falter, and we're seeing globally that unemployment's increasing as well. This diagram illustrates that we're already seeing many of the precious elements that we rely on for a lot of what we consume to have a short period of time before they run out. So those in yellow are limited to have a very short amount of time left in there in terms of their availability. So you can see that in terms of things like phosphorus, that's predicted to have only about 30 to 40 years left before we face a real big supply problem. Another problem is that a lot of the elements we rely on are things that we rely on for renewable energy as well. And we're finding that in concentrations of waste, you're finding more elements than are being dug out of the earth in some of the ores that are being mined now as well. So we're throwing away a huge amount of waste that is potentially valuable. And there's predicted to be a 40 billion tonne shortage of materials by 2050. And obviously the impact of that on the world and on the economy would be absolutely devastating. And this kind of risk to our supplies creates real volatility. And we saw price volatility in the first decade of the 21st century, much higher than for any other decade over the 20th century. So, for example, in 2004, the price has still shot up by 40%. And it's really hard for businesses to be able to cope with those kinds of fluctuations in 1 year. So we're seeing growing demand from across the world, and we're seeing less and less supply. And we know that we recycle, but recycling alone isn't going to get us out of this problem. We only recycle a small amount of the resources that we have. And it doesn't prevent the creation of waste in the first place. So is there an alternative? Well, the circular economy concept recognises that materials are finite and that they need to be returned in cycles. So in this way, it looks at the production of goods as if they were systems in nature. Natural systems, as you know, they operate in cycles where food for one becomes waste product, and then that becomes a food source for something else. And our existing resource efficiency models are about slowing down the resource use and making things less bad, whereas what the circular economy talks about is actually avoiding waste altogether. It's about preserving value, and it's also about decoupling resource use from economic growth. So, for example, if you think about a power drill. Now, a power drill is in total used for about 20 minutes over its useful life. So, as a person, we don't need we don't need a power drill sitting on our shelf for most of its life. What we need is access to a power drill when we need it. And by changing that kind of relationship with resources, we can save on resources, we can save ourselves money, and the company has an interest in making sure that that power drill lasts for as long as possible. So the circular economy is not a new concept. It's been around as an idea for a long time, and here you can see just a handful of the people that have contributed to that idea, and this isn't all, there's a lot more. On the left we have Harold Hotelling. So he was a statistician, and in the 1930s he said exploiting abundant cheap materials may be profitable in the short term, but it's not viable indefinitely. So he was an economist who already recognised the problems that were heading our way. And the term circular economy was first used in the 1990 book by Pearson Turner. That was called Economics of Natural Resources and the Environment. And on the right you can see Gunter Pauli, and he began the Blue Economy project in 2004. He noted that we need to change from ever lower costs to ever higher generation of value. And his concept, the blue economy, emphasises the need for local consumption and production based on what you already have. And we know that the idea of circular economy is gaining more and more support. Part of the reason probably you're interested in hearing about it today. And one of the organisations that have been driving that recently are the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And they've really been bringing together different schools of thought on this issue. And they've been highlighting the economic value of the model. Now their work builds on the model created by McDonough and Braungard, and they created the Cradle to Cradle concept, and their book Cradle to Cradle was written in 2002. And this is the idea that there are two material pathways. You have one that's non-toxic or biological resources which can safely re-enter the environment, and you have another loop which is toxic high quality technical materials, and they need to be circled in closed loops. And Cradle to Cradle is now a certified program, and I'll come back to that later. So what you can see here is Ellen MacArthur's circular economy model, and this is quite a famous model now, and I'll talk you through it briefly. So you have the linear economy as we know it down the middle, where materials are taken from the ground, something's manufactured, we buy it, we throw it away, it might be burned for energy recovery, it might go to landfill. But what's important about this is that there are two different cycles. They differentiate between consumable and durable components. And on the left, this is the biological cycle. This is the biological materials side of the model. And it's around consumables, and these are non-toxic biological ingredients that can safely be returned to our biosphere. And the key to this cycle is that it's all about rebuilding stock. We want to cascade the stock, the materials that we have, because that adds value. So once a material is no longer used in one form, it can be used in another form. So that's what we mean by cascading. So for example, if you had a cotton garment, once you're not using it for that anymore, you might use it as stuffing in upholstery. Once you're not using it as that anymore, you might use it as an insulation material. And then eventually, when it's degraded too much, then you'll return it to the soil so that it can rebuild our soils. On the other side, we have the technical materials side, and this is for durables. So these are toxic materials or materials that don't break down in our biosphere. So that's things like plastics. And these aren't suitable to enter the biosphere. We want to keep them out of it. So we need to keep them in their own cycles. And to do this, we need to think about the materials in a different way. We need to design in reuse from the start. And as you can see, there are different loops. There are different ways we can keep the materials in use and keep the value of them. So the first loop is about maintenance. It's about repairs. The second one is about reusing the item. The next one is about remanufacturing the item or refurbishing it. And the next one is about disassembling the item so that the parts can be reused. And finally, it's about recycling the parts. In this cycle, there isn't a consumer, there's only a user. So that relationship with the materials changes completely. And the aim is to keep the embedded value in the product for much longer by keeping it cycling in tighter loops. And also, crucially, the energy needed for these should be from renewable sources, so for both sides of the loops. And in this model, we see that there are 4 sources of value creation, 4 ways that we can increase productivity. And the first one's the power of the inner circle, and that relies on maintaining the product rather than taking it apart. So this means that we're preserving the embedded energy in the labour by keeping it as intact as possible, because if we take it apart or grind it down for recycling, you're only keeping part of the value and part of the embedded energy that's gone into making that product. The second one is the power of circling longer, and this relies on us using the products longer. So every time we use a product again, the cost per usage goes down. So in this cycle, you aim to maximise the time in the cycle and maximise the number of cycles. The third one's the power of cascaded use. So this is about linking the waste from one product to use as an input for another product, and that refers back to the cotton example I was giving earlier. And then the last one is the power of pure circles. And so we're going to have more value from a product if it's kept uncontaminated, if the material streams are kept separate, because we can increase the collection efficiency, we can maintain the quality, and we can use it for longer. So what are some of the benefits of the circular economy? Well, hopefully they're quite obvious from what I've said. It's the fact that they address some of the problems that we set out in the beginning. We're finding that they help to reduce the risk of supply and price changes. They can help to reduce the costs of products. They can create new jobs through things like reverse logistics, because you have to be able to take back products to reuse them. And this is done all while we preserve the natural capital of those materials. So we're reducing CO2, we're sending less waste to landfill. We're also seeing that it creates a competitive advantage for companies, and Accenture is an organisation that looks at this, and they found that companies benefiting from the circular economy have really rethought what they deliver to customers, and they've changed their business models accordingly. So it's not just them getting benefits, it's also their customers. So for example, on the right you can see Nike have created Flyknit. So this is a shoe upper, and it's created from knitted material, and it uses a few single threads. And this makes it 80% less wasteful when it's being produced, but it also means that they can create a lighter shoe which is better fitting, which is better for the customer as well. And we know that moving towards a circular economy would provide a net material cost saving of more than $60 billion a year by 2025. To change to circular systems, we as consumers and businesses, we need to start doing things differently. We need to change from owning things to accessing things, accessing what we need. The example I gave earlier about not really needing to own a power drill. And we're starting to see these models through things like car sharing. And new businesses also need to change their models and how they look at what value that they create. And Accenture reviewed over 120 companies, and they found that they think there are these 5 key models for driving circular economy, and they're the ones you can see here. So there's the circular supply chain, there's recovery and recycling, there's product life extension, there's the sharing economy or sharing platforms, and there's products which are actually services. So what I'm going to do is give you a bit of an example of all of those. So firstly, we have the circular supply chain, and this is basically using fully renewable, recyclable or biodegradable materials, and they can be used in consecutive life cycles. And this helps to create predictable, long-term, cost-effective sources of energy and materials. This model is particularly important for businesses where they're using products which are already becoming scarce or where they have a big environmental footprint. So on the left, AkzoNobel is a global paints and coatings company, and they've developed a new coating from plant oils and from recycled plastic bottles. And this coating is used as part of a fully recyclable and compostable paper cup. It's the first one. This is for cold drinks, not for hot drinks, unfortunately. But it helps also to preserve the paper's fibre quality, and it means that the paper can be used for other products too. And on the right, this is an example of packaging by a company called Ecovative. Now, they're using agricultural byproducts, things like corn stalks, and using mushroom mycelium to bind them together to create biodegradable packaging. And it makes a product that's cost and quality competitive with things like plastic foam. It's already being used by a large number of companies, including people like Dell. And in this model, it's important to be able to trace material flows. And companies like Maersk, who have ships and are involved in the shipping industry, they now have passports for the materials that are contained within their ships, so they can improve the recycling rates on them. The next one is resource recovery. And the idea around this business model is to identify new uses for waste, so not just the end product, but also byproducts and all materials. It is aiming to eliminate waste altogether. And solutions include things like industrial symbiosis and cradle-to-cradle materials. And this is good for companies that produce large amounts of byproducts, or where it's possible for them to reprocess their products cost effectively. And this can be things like the food industry, where there's large amounts of waste that can use anaerobic digestion to create energy. On the left, Procter & Gamble are looking at this in their manufacturing facilities, and they now have 45 zero waste facilities. All of their waste is recycled, repurposed or converted to energy. And that's things like in the US, scraps from their Pampers plant are used for upholstery filling. And in Mexico, the waste from their Charmin plants is used for roof tiles for the local community. On the right, we have another example, and this might be one some of you are familiar with, and that's Marks and Spencer's Take Back scheme. So they're working with Oxfam to allow customers to take back clothes to Oxfam stores, and in exchange people were given M&S vouchers. And then the clothes were either resold or recycled. And you have the customer, Marks and Spencer's and Oxfam all benefiting from that take back of resources. The third is product life extension. We usually throw away products when they're broken or when we don't want them anymore, and that can be for a variety of reasons. It can be for clothing, it might be they've gone out of fashion. For things like our technology, there might be better performance coming along. But if we were able to repair, upgrade, remanufacture or remarket those products, we can keep them in use for longer. And also we might be able to generate additional revenue for ourselves, or as a company they might be able to do that. And this model requires the relationship to change for a business from a simple purchase by a customer to an ongoing relationship, because they'll need upgrades and alterations to the product. And this can lead to more loyal customers, and customers might be able to customize what they're buying as well. So an example of this is mobile phones. Mobile phones are more increasingly being replaced, not when they're broken, but because new performance comes along, improved performance. We don't want our old phone anymore. So to overcome this, modular designs are being looked at and created, and on the screen you can see Fairphone, and this is the first modular phone that's come out, and they're hoping that it will be able to be shipped by December. And in this phone, the battery, the backing, the speakers, the camera, they can all be replaced. So it's easier to repair, and it means it can be customized as well. And Electrolux are another company that uses modular design. This is to help it simplify products and to make repairs easier. As I mentioned, another way that you can increase the useful life of the product is by resale. And I'm sure you'll all be familiar with things like eBay, really increasing how we sell our products and create income for ourselves. Next, number 4 is the sharing economy or sharing platforms. And a few facts for you here. So 80% of items that we have in our home are typically used only once a month. And in the EU, our cars are usually parked about 90% of the time. So we have a real basis of underused assets that are being wasted, just sitting there idle. But there are new technologies that are allowing businesses to rent, swap, share or lend goods when they're not in use. And this means that there are fewer resources going into making products. And then consumers and businesses can make money by ensuring that other people can use those underutilized assets. You will all be aware of examples of this, I know, through things like Airbnb and Uber, and there are hundreds of other examples, and there's new sites and new apps coming along all the time. And the final model is product as a service model. So Rolls-Royce is an example of this for their jet engines. The jet engines aren't bought, they're not for sale, they're leased. And Rolls-Royce manage the product end to end. And they install, service and monitor in the air, and they replace and recycle the parts. So they deliver a service, not just a product. And they call this power by the hour. But this isn't new. This began in 1962. We also have other examples of this, like car leasing. So car leasing's been around for decades, but recently we're finding the model is growing and gaining popularity. And we're finding that it's attractive to companies with products with high operating costs and which are difficult to repair. And the change is, this needs to change the relationship that people have from owning to accessing materials. And it means that the material remains the responsibility of the producer. In this way, you can have more loyal customers, and customers can have more reliable products. And an example of this, a more recent example, is Philips, and they've started offering pay per lux. And this allows customers to purchase an amount of light rather than purchasing lamps and cables. And it means the customer saves on the upfront cost, and Philips has a tied-in customer because they have a contract, but they also want to ensure that their lamps last as long as possible. Well, if this is such a great model, why are we finding that there are not every single company in the world adopting this circular economy model? Well, there's some challenges they need to overcome. There are complex supply chains which would need to be reconfigured. You can have resistance from within companies to change. And there might be upfront costs, you might need to invest in new technology, there could be changes to revenue streams. There's also at the moment a lack of infrastructure for returning products, so that reverse logistics problem. And some legislation can make some items difficult to recycle at the moment. And complex materials can be difficult to separate for recycling. Or they might just not know about the opportunities or understand how they can transition. So it's important for companies to look carefully at what could work and understand how circular economy works. They'll need to look at product design from the start and also how they work with customers and that relationship. And they might also need new skills across their organisation to do this. But we are finding that the technological revolution is enabling this change. We're finding that things like mobile technology can help match supply and demand anywhere, wherever you are. So if you think of Uber, wherever you are, you can identify the nearest taxi for you. And social media can reach millions of people in one go. And cloud computing is something that allows dematerialization of products. So if you think of things like Spotify, iTunes, Netflix, we don't need physical stock anymore. We just need access to those DVDs and those CDs, or that music and those films. And we're finding that digital music is 40 to 80% lower in terms of CO2 emissions. There are also other techs out there that are helping trace materials better through the supply chain, identifying material fractions much better. And new engineering is helping with modular design, and we're seeing things like 3D printing enabling the circular economy as well. Let's come back to cradle products. So this is an eco-label. Cradle to Cradle is administered by the Products Innovation Institute. It was founded in 2010 by McDonough and Braungard, and it really emphasises the importance of designing the right things with the right materials. It uses a standard assessment for quality and innovation, and products have to meet 5 criteria, and you can see them here on this slide, those 5 that start with material health. And there are 5 levels of certification, so basic, bronze, silver, gold and platinum. And to become certified, then the company must be able to take back goods for reuse or recycling. So they need to develop the right logistics, and they need to have the right levels of quality and the right amounts of well, high levels of materials coming back to them to recycle. You can see around the edge some of the organisations and companies that already have cradle-to-cradle products. And another example is Desso. So Desso decided in 2008 that they wanted to make all of their products cradle-to-cradle certified by 2020. They are a company that allows other companies to lease carpet tiles for 8 to 10 years, and then they're returned back to Desso. And to drive the cradle-to-cradle loop, they created a new separation technique called Refinity, and this helps them to separate the yarn and fibres from the carpet backing. And the fibres can then be reused as a new yarn. They also invested in their own recycling facilities, and they invested in the reverse logistics needed to return those products to their sites. So I've talked a bit about businesses and what they're doing to change to the circular economy, but what are cities and local authorities doing? There are obvious ways that the government can help the circular economy through legislation and taxes, and that's the same with making any new changes and bringing any new concept in. But what else are cities doing to facilitate the drive to the circular economy? And in the UK, we're seeing some interesting examples emerge. So Glasgow is one of these. And they've been working with the Zero Waste Scotland organisation and the Chamber of Commerce. They looked at what was happening with the materials and the waste flows and energy use in their city and how that was coming into and out of the city. And they looked across a range of different sectors, and on the screen you can see this is healthcare, and this is one of the circular economy scans that they created for healthcare. And this work identified that the food and drinks industry had the most potential to transition to a circular economy. And they identified from this work that for the food and drinks industry there were 9 key strategies, and from this they focused in on 4. And they were heat recovery from bakery ovens, aquaponics, so that's growing fish with soilless crops, and that's saved them huge amounts of water, beer from bread, which is what it says on the tin, and high value cascading in brewery industries, which is basically using the spent grain from brewing to replace some of the flour in bread. And they're now working with the business sector to test out these concepts. And they're doing some really interesting stuff. They're also working with designers, so people like the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturing and Commerce, on looking at designing for the circular economy and how those the education around that needs to change. They're looking at public procurement opportunities, and they're looking at helping businesses identify circular economy models. So Zero Waste Scotland launched a circular economy investment fund with £18 million of grant funding for businesses recently, and that's to help them explore market feasibility and to develop and take up technical products and services to support the circular economy. Another example is over in London, so that's where I am today. And in London, the London Waste and Recycling Board and the Greater London Authority have been working on a roadmap to help London transition to a circular economy. And initially they're concentrating on 5 focus areas, and these are the built environment, textiles, food, electricals and plastics. And they've identified those because of their impact on the environment currently and how much they think the circular economy could provide new opportunities and new advantages. And LWARB have created working groups for each of these areas, and they're working on chapters of the roadmap at the moment. And they'll identify partners, they'll look at challenges, and they're also looking to create action plans across 5 enabling sectors. And those enabling sectors are the digital, financial and service, media, higher education and government sectors. And they really want to help businesses by offering support through all stages of looking at the circular economy, right from start-up size to scale up. And they'll be providing a range of funding and setting up incubators and support programs as well. They're also working with people like myself to look at public sector procurement, and not just local authorities but police and fire and rescue, and they'll select a few key opportunities to focus on. And that could be things like better use of public and office spaces, looking at sharing of items that we all need to use across local authorities, so like a library of things, and using the products as services model as well. And we're also seeing some interesting things happen over at Peterborough. They have a different approach. They started with one industrial area and a core group of businesses, and they investigated with them through workshops wasted opportunities for sharing of items, and they've created a sharing platform to exchange goods and services. And in Sutton, this is the slide that you can see now is something that we're looking at. We're looking to help not only our borough, so if you're not familiar with London, there are 33 London boroughs. We can't look at the circular economy in isolation. We need to work with our neighbours. We're looking at South London, and initially we want to do a circular economy scan like Glasgow have to identify the waste flows and where we have the key opportunities. But we're also looking at how we drive innovation, and we want to create a green economy incubation hub. And this will help to provide a programme of support for entrepreneurs and SMEs. And we want to also look at some innovation challenges that key companies are facing and work with them to identify solutions. And in the shorter term, we're looking at things like our own procurement, working with the GLA on what they're doing, and offering repair and reuse activities. And obviously the whole host of activities that local authorities usually do around waste and recycling. So I think the key points here are that cities are helping through the development of visions, through facilitating partnerships, providing policies, helping with business access to finance and identifying new technologies, and really encouraging innovation to come forward. So in summary then of what I've said today, I think that the circular economy is about moving beyond efficiency. It's about removing waste altogether. And we need to look at resources in a different way, and that's to preserve the value that they have in them. And if it's done the right way, it can be highly successful and it can create prosperity and regenerate environments. But businesses, governments, cities, all of us as consumers, we all need to play a part in moving towards a circular economy. But the opportunities it creates make me optimistic that we can do that. And McDonough said that commerce is the only human institution big enough, creative enough and fast enough to be the engine of principled prosperity and beneficial change. And I think that really is the point of circular economy, that this could make a huge change to how we do things across the globe. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. I know we've got some questions that have come in, and some other questions have been coming in while we've been on air. So what I will be doing is briefly stopping to have a look at those questions, and then I'll come back in a minute to go through those questions and provide some of the answers. So thank you very much for listening today. Please hang on a bit and we'll be right back with you. Okay, welcome back.
Okay, my name's Emma. I'm going to be asking Andrea some questions today. So our first one is, when we leave the EU, how can we maintain momentum on this important agenda, particularly in England where progress so far has been so slow?
The fact is that when we leave the EU, it's not going to be that we throw away all of what we've been working towards anyway. I think in terms of what we're doing, the fact that we're leaving the EU highlights the need for us to change the way we look at and value products and materials anyway. What we need to do is ensure that it's the businesses that understand what the important, how they can prosper from this model. And I think to a large extent that's happening anyway because of some of the issues that I outlined previously, the fact that we're facing such big supply and demand problems. So it's really being driven by those sorts of issues. And I think England have said that they do want to maintain momentum. And I hope that's true. And I think some of the work that cities have been doing is where we need to be concentrating. So as I said, there are some barriers to the circular economy which aren't, for smaller businesses, they're not going to be easy to unlock. So I think that cities and local authorities and the government have a facilitating role there that we need to be looking at. I also think that public procurement can help to drive that agenda. And I think even though we're leaving the EU, we're not going anywhere physically. So we need to keep maintain the links that we have. A lot of large companies are global companies, so it doesn't matter if some of our policies change to them. They still have global supply chains that they'll need to address and need to look at the circular economy across all of those. But I think that in terms of what we've been doing, it's just going to be carrying on the same and driving it in the same way, and that's basically because it's driven by the economy.
Great. So we have one from Jonathan Randalls, who is at DHL Global Forwarding, and he asks, if the circular economy is to be driven primarily from consumer activities in the future, who is going to be involved in persuading the public to think about the life cycle of products?
I think there's some companies that are already leading the way on this. So if you look at companies by Patagonia, they're already really highlighting the issues to customers, and they're getting customers to sign a pledge supporting what they do in terms of the circular economy and pledging to look at what they do as well. So you're seeing some companies that are really taking that message to the market. But and you'll always get companies that want to illustrate their corporate responsibility and emphasise that, but I don't really see that is what's going to drive the most consumers towards the circular economy. You'd always get a percentage of us that are interested for environmental reasons and won't buy certain products if they're not recycled. But primarily, consumers are going to move to this model because of the benefits it provides to them. So if you, for example, you're looking at things like Rent the Runway, people can have access to high-end fashion, which they could never afford themselves before. They can have a dress off of the catwalk and wear it for the day and then return it. So it's really cheap for them. They have access to a product. So it's that's driving it. It's the accessibility. It's the customer service. That is what will make the changes. And I think most of those customers, they don't even realise they're part of the circular economy. They're just finding that what they need is offered to them in a different way, and it's more preferable to them.
Okay, so I've got a question from Daniel Doran. He's asking, how can circular economy-based improvements to products be measured, recognised and rewarded, for example, via subsidies, tax breaks, BREEAM, etc.?
So this is a real question that the industry itself is grappling with at the moment, as I understand it. How do you firstly measure a change towards a circular economy? How do you have indicators that show that you're doing that? And then how do you make sure that you're rewarded for that? So I think some of the what was mentioned in the question were right, actually, that it will be initially it could be rewards via subsidies and tax breaks, but I think it will need us to change things like BREEAM. It needs to be adapted to ensure that we're addressing those what can be created through the circular economy, and making sure that we're recognising that there are different ways and different models for doing things. And I think there should be a few new tools coming out and a few new global ways that we can look at this issue. And I'm sure it's things that the likes of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation are already way ahead, and they run the Circular Economy 100, which is 100 of the top organisations that are looking at this, and so I'd be really interested to see what's coming out of there and what their latest thinking on this is as well.
I have a question for Laura Tomai, I think that's how you say it. She's an environmental sciences Open University student with the IS, and she asks, considering that the UK is very much dependent for primary resources and material from other countries, with Brexit and the pound sterling decline on the currency market, do you see an acceleration of the adoption of circular economy more likely by UK manufacturers?
Yeah, I think this is a good point, and what's happened and with the changes that has happened in this market, this really helps to illustrate one of the key factors leading the take-up of the circular economy, and that's price volatility alongside increasing demand. And what's happened with the uncertainty around Brexit and the issues that that's created for the market just highlights the fact that this is another reason for companies to look at the circular economy model. So yeah, I do think anything that illustrates that kind of volatility helps push towards a circular economy model.
I have a question from Andy Haig next. Do you see the value of targeting circular economy in the construction industry? Are there examples of this already?
Yes, absolutely, and the built environment and construction is one of the key things that has been identified in London as one of the key sectors that they're focusing on, primarily because of because it has so much value and there's so much that can be gained by working with the construction industry, and the industry, all of the industries around are creating and developing new developments. I think that this is already happening in places like London. So the GLA and LWARB are looking at redevelopment in terms of places like the Old Oaks Park site, and what they want to do is make sure that they have a circular economy plan in place so that before even any construction happens, they do understand how they can make the most from that development. So looking at things like the materials themselves that are going into the ground, where they're coming from, how they are going to be able to trace those materials. So using the buildings that are created and constructed as material banks that can then be broken down when they're no longer needed in 2030, however many years after that building's going to be there. And obviously the recovery of materials, there are new ways that can happen in the construction industry. And I think that with, as I was saying before, improvements in technology, you're going to see improvements in our ability to identify and recover different construction materials. And the other side of what's happening in the construction industry is modular design, designed to be created and then taken apart again in the future. And part of this is also using things like the 3D printers that I mentioned as a new technology, and that's helping the construction industry because if you're able to manufacture only exactly the materials and the amount of materials that you need, then you hugely cut down on the amount of waste that you create. You can also make sure that you're not transporting goods miles and miles. You're using materials locally, and you're feeding them into 3D printers, and then what's coming out, it hasn't been transported halfway across the world. So that's not there, that's not on a large scale. These are all trials at the moment, but I think that's really going to start to change the construction industry over the next 10 years or so. And like I said, you're already getting things happening in London where we're looking at from the ground up how construction and how developments work.
So one barrier to circular business models is that some recovered or recycled minerals or resources, such as phosphorus, are too expensive when competing with the virgin equivalents. Is there any way that we can address this?
I think it's likely that this, to start with, it's going to require regulation, and that is going to be one of the primary drivers for these kinds of models where it is too expensive at the moment. We'll also need to work with the industry to get commitment from the industry to work on recovery of such materials. But eventually, again, it will be driven by economics, and the materials themselves will become too expensive to source from virgin materials. My understanding is that phosphorus comes from, primarily at the moment, there's one mine in Morocco. So when you're looking at constraints like that, you can see that, as I was saying earlier, there's about 30 to 40 years left in resources of phosphorus. The industry, it needs to be looking now at what it can do anyway, and we're already seeing people like Thames Water recovering phosphorus. There's a lot of in our waste water systems, and they're creating products from that, creating fertilizers from that, and so that's already happening, and there are plants already being built, and I think we'll see that happen more and more and more.
And our final question, it's another one from Laura to mine. So, as adopting circular economy at this time is mostly voluntary and implemented by visionary companies only, is there any sign that the current government will facilitate its adoption with subsidies or any additional taxation on virgin material import?
I can't speak for the government, but I've spoken to people like Wayne Hubbard, who's the CEO of the London Waste and Recycling Board, and his comment on this was that he completely disagrees that adopting circular economy is voluntary or implemented by visionary companies only. And what he's seeing is the real big global companies that are working on this now, and that's because of the economic benefits, not, obviously they'll say it's for environmental reasons. I'm sure that's part of it, but he thinks it's the increasing profitability that is making it popular, and we're talking about billions of pounds worth of value creation here. So why would big businesses not look at that? It would be crazy for them. And Accenture have said that at the moment a third of global CEOs are looking at the circular economy. So that's a third of the major corporations across the globe. So with that kind of interest, you can just see how big this is becoming, and so I'm hopeful, and I think it's something that isn't just remaining as a small scale thing. There's visionary companies there, and there's a lot of innovation coming through, but there are some real big ground movements by the big global corporations as well.
So that's all the questions that we had time for today. Thank you everybody for submitting your questions to Andrea, and thank you, Andrea, for your talk today.
Okay, and thank you to the IES for hosting.